Honourable members, please be seated.
Introduction of visitors, introduction of guests, ministerial statements, member statements.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Highlands Norwood.
Our current public health emergency has highlighted the need for bold leadership to finally tackle homelessness in Alberta. Those experiencing homelessness deserve to be properly protected and supported during COVID-19. This is why it's so hard to see this government pointing to mats on floors a few feet apart as a positive step to address this crisis. These are our neighbours, our friends, our family members. They deserve dignity and compassion now and always. I'm not here to be critical of the incredible frontline workers who I know are working non-stop at this very moment to do everything they can to support folks. Nor am I here to be critical of just one government. Allowing homelessness in our society is a choice made by consecutive governments at multiple levels. It is a failure of decades of inadequate housing policy. Since the deep cuts of the 90s, there's been an exponential increase in homelessness, both provincially and nationally. Modern housing announcements pale in comparison to what Canada once did to ensure that no one went without a safe place to sleep at night. We know that the federal government's current approach to on-reserve housing is unacceptable, but it can be different. We can do better because we've done it before. Past governments built, maintained, and publicly managed affordable housing units and supported the development of member-owned housing cooperatives. Not that many years ago, Alberta even had a rent bank for tenants to access supports and help prevent evictions. This pandemic demonstrates why we need to do better, for humanitarian reasons, of course, but also as a way of ensuring the wider public health and safety of everyone as well. And if the moral argument doesn't work in that it's the right thing to do, then consider the economic argument. It's also the smart thing to do for our budgets. Housing is health care. Addressing housing is an upstream approach to health, to justice, to reducing the strain on public services. We can treat people with the respect they deserve now, and we can end homelessness if we choose to. If we can scramble to house folks in a cold snap or in a pandemic, why can't we at all other times? Housing is a human right. And as we think about our next steps, let's act like it.
The Honourable, the Member for Cardston, Siksika.
Mr. Speaker, it's an honour to rise today to pay tribute to a man who dedicated his life to Albertans and truly understood the word service. On November 26, 2019, Mr. Jack Adey, former MLA for Cardston and Minister of Advanced Education and Career Development, passed away at the age of 87. Mr. Adey was survived by his wife Darlene, 4 sons, Don, Doug, John, Rob, and 1 daughter, Lori, 26 grandchildren, and 38 great-grandchildren. Beyond his service, Mr. Adey personified everything that was culturally and historically characterized as the Alberta way of life. In his earlier days, Mr. Adey worked in the oil fields until 1975, when he decided to get back to his rural roots, bought a mixed farm and ranch near Hill Spring. Wanting to serve his community more, Mr. Adey ran for political office in 1986 and was elected to the legislature here in the further constituency of Cardston. In 1992, Premier Ralph Klein appointed him as the Minister of Advanced Education and Career Development, a position he held until he left this chamber in 1997. Even after serving in this place for 10 years, 10 months, and 3 days, his public service and dedication to bettering the lives of Albertans continued. In 2000, he was appointed to the chair of the Chinook Region's Board of Directors, Health Region's Board of Directors, and later appointed to the Alberta Health Super Board, where he served until he actually retired from public life in 2010. Today, as a thank you and tribute to his years of public service, his name lives on through the Jack Adey Cancer Centre in Lethbridge. But, Mr. Speaker, as good a man and public servant as you think Jack Adey was, he was an even better husband, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, friend, devout member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and raiser of Tennessee walking horses. As the member for Cardston Siksika, it is an honor to carry on the torch and follow in his footsteps. May he rest in peace.
The Honourable Member for Brooks Medicine Hat.
Mr. Speaker, the COVID-19 pandemic is placing a spotlight on essential workers who are keeping Alberta moving through this challenging time. Long-haul truckers, grocery store workers, delivery drivers, and of course, frontline health workers have received the recognition that they deserve throughout this crisis. As Easter weekend approaches, many of my younger constituents have been asking about somebody who is usually hopping around this time of year. With social distancing rules in place and public health officials advising against visits during Easter long weekend, I have heard from concerned Albertans who are wondering whether the Easter Bunny will be able to carry out his important visits to homes in Alberta this year. Well, Mr. Speaker, I would like to assure you and all Albertans, young and old, that the Easter Bunny is an essential worker and he will be welcome to conduct the important work of delivering Easter chocolate, treats, and youthful joy this weekend. Like all Albertans, the Easter Bunny is working hard to practice physical distancing and good hygiene while he makes his visits to households across the province. He's been practicing frequent paw washing and is staying at 5 bunny lengths or 6 feet away from others when he leaves his burrow. The Easter Bunny will be different. The Easter will be different for many families this year. Instead of large family dinners, we will be keeping things much closer to home in the days to come. But Easter is by no means cancelled, and there are still many reasons to be excited, Mr. Speaker. The Easter Bunny will be making his rounds, and some communities are setting up their own egg hunt by putting up pictures of colorful Easter eggs in their windows for youngsters to spy on their walks by. While Easter may be a bit different this year, there are many ways to celebrate and keep a safe distance. The Easter story is one of hope, new life, and in the Easter Bunny's case, a little fun. And his story will live on no matter the circumstances. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'd just like to know if the Easter Bunny will be coming to my house is the real question. The Honourable Member for Leduc Beaumont has a statement to make.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On April 9th, 1917, Canadians launched its assault on Vimy Ridge. For 3 days, the 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps came together and pressed ahead towards the ridge at Vimy, taking back key territory from the Germans. When the dust settled, Canadians had captured a strategic position that eluded the French and British forces for years. It was a defining moment for a young nation that was often pushed into the shadow of Great Britain. Many Albertans fought bravely at the Battle of Vimy Ridge, including distinguished sniper Henry Norwest. Born in Fort Saskatchewan of French and Cree ancestry, Norwest was a ranch hand and rodeo performer before enlisting in 1915. He became one of Canada's most famous snipers and was awarded the Military Medal for the bravery he displayed at Vimy Ridge. Like any such victory, its commemoration takes on a somber tone. There were thousands of Canadian casualties during the battle, including 3,600 who were killed. Each of these men had a family who mourned their loss and a future that was cut tragically short. Today, Vimy is remembered as more than just a battle of the First World War. It was a moment that showed the strength of our young nation and the dedication of Canadians to their cause. Now we face a new type of battle against a very different enemy. I believe that we can still learn a great deal from the legacy of Vimy Ridge. We can learn from the level of preparation, dedication, focus, and the drive to succeed in the shadow of the unknown and enormous risk. In this battle, we must make our own sacrifices and support each other. We must celebrate the bravery of those on the front lines of this fight, and in 100 years, I hope that Albertans will look back with pride on the way we showed strength in the fight and the supporting one another together in this trying time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable members, I hope you'll accept my apology. I have a small error in the order today. We will now have Member Statement 4, followed by Member Statement 6. The Honourable, the Member for Edmonton-Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Alberta's small businesses aren't just struggling during the shutdown. Many are in real and immediate jeopardy of going under. We have heard from small businesses that the strategy of the Government of Alberta to defer costs isn't working. All it's doing is leading to increased debt that many, if not most, will be unable to recover from. According to the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, small businesses are in a cash crisis and a debt nightmare. They need immediate help and are begging this government to take their very survival seriously. According to the most recent survey, rent is their biggest fear. Fully 1/3 of small businesses won't make it through April. The situation is dire in Alberta. With the Premier's estimate that social distancing will certainly be in place through May, many small businesses are giving up hope entirely. They appreciate the federal government's promised actions, but they fear it will come too late, and they know it will not be enough. The Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses have listed their calls to action that are squarely a matter for provincial jurisdiction. Today, we laid out the official opposition action plan to support small businesses. It is a product of our consultation with the real small business owners who are on the ground and struggling right now. We're calling for an emergency rent subsidy to a maximum of $10,000, a government backstop of up to $7,500 for landlords who agree to defer rent for 3 months for businesses during the pandemic. Businesses will have the ability to pay back the amount owing over the subsequent 18 months. An insurance premium freeze retroactive to March 18th and a 50% reduction on premiums until December 31st, 2020. A $5,000 grant to help small businesses adapt to the new environment, and a $10 million Festivals Guarantee Program to support these critical events for small businesses. The time for bold action is now. We urge the government to take our ideas, even take credit for our ideas, to help small businesses survive this crisis. Thank you.
We learned yesterday that 29 Albertans have died from COVID-19. The vast majority of those deaths were Albertans over 80 years of age. Like many Albertans, I'm concerned for my parents. My mom and dad, 83 and 90 respectively, are in the high-risk age group. Each day I think of all the families in Alberta who are doing their best to navigate these unknown territories. Albertans are carrying heavy, heavy burdens. As a legislator, I am thinking about what we can do to support Albertans. We know from a review of the countries who are ahead of us in dealing with the pandemic, societies with robust public programs and high social cohesion are better able to overcome the challenges. We heard from our own Chief Medical Officer of Health that having one public health system makes navigating the challenges much easier than having one with many private providers. In our seniors housing area, we are not as fortunate. We have a mishmash of private and public delivery. Even before the pandemic, there were many outstanding issues: not enough staff to care for residents, low levels of pay for frontline workers, and a lack of provincial funding for essential supports. Tragically, the pandemic has made things significantly worse. At this crucial time, our government must ensure that regardless of private or public, all seniors housing facilities must be supported through a province-wide staffing strategy. Staff must be recruited, trained, and supported to fill the many vacancies in the sector. Some facilities have vacancies of 50%. All staff must be supported with hazard pay as they are putting themselves in harm's way. Surge funding of 20% over current operating budgets for the next 6 months is needed to cover these expenses. The UCP government needs to step up and ensure seniors housing facilities are supported as if we did have a robust public system. Lives are dependent on it.
The honourable member for Red Deer South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No one here intended to serve during a global pandemic. But life is not predictable, and this is where we find ourselves. I love unsung heroes all around us who quietly and consistently, without recognition or reward, with the love of God and of man in their hearts, serve those around them. Heroes are defined by how they do their job, by example, serving in love, which edifies even the most humble of tasks into something sacred and special. I know this is true. When the world is in commotion, there is safety in true principles to carry us through to better days. One such principle is the virtue of preparation. Personal storehouses of physical and spiritual preparedness increase resilience. Prudent preparation is an antidote to fear. Mr. Speaker, this pandemic reminds us of our shared mortality. Each day is a gift, an opportunity to start afresh, to do and be better. What a wonderful blessing. We do not need to be discouraged if we are not perfectly prepared. None of us are. As this challenge subsides, and it will, all of us will be blessed with opportunities to strengthen our individual, our family preparedness, so as future challenges arise, and they will, we can be blessed with peace of conscience and capacity to encourage and serve those around us in love. Thank you.
The honourable member for Banff-Kananaskis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As odd as this may sound, COVID-19 has truly brought out the best in us and given us the opportunity to show the world just what it truly means to be Albertan. Despite the horrors going on around us of illness and death, business closures and personnel layoffs, a lot of good has emerged through it all. People have been helping people, business communities have banded together, local communities have found strength in their heart and their pride for the place they call home, and even the discourse online has become friendlier and more respectful. Even amidst the most difficult times we've faced in a generation, Albertans have risen to new heights and done their part to make this world a better place. Last week, our government announced the Alberta Bits and Pieces program to allow individuals and businesses to offer support. In that one short week, more than 2,900 offers of support have come in to our government, including passenger and commercial vehicles, hotel rooms, mobile trailers, food and water services, hospital gowns, face masks, ventilators, personal protection equipment, data modeling, and even the delivery of surprise Easter baskets. But the good news story doesn't stop there. In our own riding of Banff Kananaskis, there has been a tremendous outpouring of support from restaurants, shops, and businesses who are choosing to help others despite the hardships that they themselves are facing. Rocky Mountain Soap Company has donated 450 bottles of hand sanitizer to frontline grocery and gas station workers, 70 liters of hand sanitizer to the medical community, and 9,500 bars of soap to various community organizations. The Grizzly House in Banff is delivering free hot meals to the front doors of seniors in need. Iron Goat is providing 150 meals a day to St. Michael's Anglican Church to ensure their weekly food and friends service can continue while ensuring their senior volunteers can stay at home safe. And Stony Dakota Casino is delivering 1,200 10-pound Easter hams to residents in Morley, Eden Valley, and Bighorn. So, Mr. Speaker, these have been incredibly difficult times for many, but they've just shown why I'm such a proud Albertan.
Here.
The honourable member for Highwood.
Mr. Speaker, in the past few weeks, our province has entered uncharted waters, and during these tough times, Albertans continue to show their strength and resolve. Without question, we have seen incredible acts of empathy, charity, and innovation. Continued proof that Albertans rise to every challenge, are compassionate, and always willing to provide a helping hand to our neighbours and all those in need. In Highwood alone, we have seen Bar None Ranch and Hubtown Brewery, along with many others, donate thousands to our local food bank. Hard Knocks Brewery are stepping up to support our Foothills Country Hospice. George Canyon conducting free online concerts. Our local food banks banding together to deliver hundreds of pounds of supplies to the Eden Valley Reserve. And Owen Plum, an Okotoks resident who has started producing Prusa face shields for frontline workers on a 3D printer his family acquired 2 years ago at Christmas. Now, Owen may not be the first nor the only person to be using this technology in Canada, but I would challenge that this 13-year-old grade 9 student may be the youngest. He has already produced over 100 of these masks, and with additional funding now coming to his way from the Okotoks Rotary Club, he plans to expand his production. Mr. Speaker, the innovation of Albertans like Owen is why we created the Bits and Pieces program, a program for people to offer similar services, a program that has now received over 3,000 offers of services, supplies, and innovations to assist with combating COVID-19. Though there are still many unknowns, what is more than evident, more than ever, is that we, in the wake of this pandemic, need to stand together united. Our differences must be set aside, and those who continue to instill fear, anxiety, and doubt need to be ignored. Owen Plum is a prime example of what is possible when we come together and focus on solutions. His example is more than just an act of charity. It strengthens our faith and reminds us that we are stronger together, and together we will get through this.
Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Presenting petitions. Notices of motions. Introduction of bills. Tabling returns and reports.
Honourable members, is there any tablings today? The Honourable Member for Lethbridge East has a tabling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to table the appropriate number of copies of the November 6, 2018 National Post article titled "Robin Luff Fires Back at the Alberta NDP After They Kick Her Out of Caucus," and which includes a letter from the former MLA Robin Luff cited yesterday during debate by the Minister of Transportation. To sum up quickly, Ms. Luff called it a tragedy of epic proportions that when she tried to advocate for mobile home residents, she was told it wasn't a priority and was not on to do the list that she couldn't ask questions or speak publicly.
Thank you for that very expansive tabling. Perhaps we can keep it a little bit shorter and more to the subject line in the future. Is there any other tablings today? Seeing none, clerk. Honorable members, it is 1:50 and we are at oral question period, and the leader of Her Majesty's official opposition has the call.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to start by acknowledging the thousands of people who have lost work. We're with you, and we will get through this. Now, the OPEC Plus news that we've just heard stands to help Albertans going further, but today's news also shows 117,000 Albertans lost their jobs, and that there's another 245,000 who may have kept their jobs but worked significantly reduced hours or more likely no hours at all. We know this is just the beginning. More Albertans will need our help as the pandemic grows. So to the Premier, what are you doing to get cash to the over 300,000 Albertans who are out of work? And by that question, I mean you, Mr. Premier, not Ottawa.
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member for the question. You know, our government is working very hard with the federal government to ensure that there are supports in place for Albertans who are out of work. A number of federal programs have been announced. This includes a CERB, employment insurance, and provincially we have announced a number of programs in terms of utility payments deferral, property tax deferral, and we continue to look at other ideas that we can support Albertans to get through these trying and difficult times.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, small businesses account for roughly half of all employment in Alberta, and they are telling us that deferrals are not enough. A recent survey found 1/3 do not have enough cash flow to pay this month's bills, and close to half are facing permanent closure. Premier, if we wait for Ottawa, there might not be addresses to send the checks to, so they need immediate support such as rent subsidies and new grants. Is this government looking at those things? Will they consider them? And if not, why not?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are focused on supporting Albertans, both employees, employers, and in fact all Albertans through these difficult times. On the employer side, we have done corporate tax deferral, WCB premium deferrals, and for small and medium-sized businesses, that also includes paying for half utility and education property tax assistance. And this is in addition to the federal programs that are already in place to assist small business. In addition, Mr. Speaker, and I failed to mention this in my previous answer, we also provide rental protection for Albertans. We understand this is a difficult time. We're continuing to look at other options, and we will announce those in the near future.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about rental support for businesses, and that's what small business is calling for. Now, the sector hardest hit by this pandemic is our hospitality industry. Almost 30% layoffs at our bars, hotels, and restaurants. These Albertans work part-time. Most of them are women. A large number are youth. Now is not the time to close emergency financial supports. Now is the time to open them. Premier, the numbers prove it. Your program left 2/3 of Albertans who need your help with nothing. Why won't you reopen this program?
The Honourable the Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my colleague has mentioned, our government has taken numerous measures to help businesses, from deferring WCB premiums, deferring education property taxes, deferring corporate tax collection, deferring utility payments. All options are on the table. We've been speaking and continue to speak daily with businesses, landlords, tenants, hearing their perspectives, their challenges, and their needs. We will continue to listen to them and will introduce further measures if needed.
The Leader of the Official Opposition for her second set of questions.
Well, we've been listening to, and newsflash, they are needed, so get on it. Now, Mr. Speaker, I was heartbroken to hear that another resident at Mackenzie Town Continuing Care Centre passed away last night. Now, we've tried repeatedly to convince this Premier and his government that these families deserve to be heard. We have 9 other facilities with outbreaks. All of them are facing some level of staffing shortage and compromised care. Once again, when will the Premier show the same leadership as BC and other provinces and step in to properly resource, coordinate, and manage staffing in long-term care across the province?
The Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and we have been working with the members of the Alberta Continuing Care Association to be able to get their feedback, to be able to move quickly on what we can do and steps we can take to make sure that they are going to have the staffing that they need in their facilities throughout the province, Mr. Speaker.
The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I think that the time for feedback is over. Now, the woman that we lost yesterday was Rita Owen. She was a month away from her 92nd birthday, and her son, Michael, told Global News that he saw no level of preparedness when he visited his mom in mid-March. Quote, "I don't think staff had enough support. I can't commend them enough for sticking it out through this, but I really wonder where the province was, why there wasn't external help rushed in." Premier, that is a damning comment. Where is the province? Waiting for consultation has passed. We need action.
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the issue here, as I said before in this House, is how we reduce risk and protect our seniors in our continuing care facilities throughout this province. And the Chief Medical Officer of Health and AHS are both taking this extremely seriously. Dr. Hinshaw, as I mentioned many times in this House, has issued 4 distinct orders on continuing care, including one just this week. And those orders are setting out specific standards for infection control throughout the pandemic and in the event of an outbreak at a specific facility. And those orders are being followed, including at the Mackenzie Town facility, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Those orders aren't helping the staff crisis, Mr. Speaker. We must be doing everything we can to support Albertans through this pandemic, especially those at risk. We can't compromise care. Now, across the country, governments are doing everything in their power to work together with frontline providers in caring for our citizens. But here, our doctors have been forced to go to court and sue the government for $250 million because this Premier tore up their contract. What will it take for this Premier to stop picking fights, creating enemies, and instead find allies and find supports in order to focus on saving lives?
Honourable members, a point of order is noted at 156. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the legal action today is what the AMA have said they were planning. It does not change our decisions. We were planning to maintain our spending on physicians at $5.4 billion, the highest level ever in this province. But in fact, we'll likely spend significantly more this year due to the decisions that we've made to support physicians and their patients during the pandemic response. And we'll continue to pay physicians under the Alberta Healthcare Insurance Act, and we'll continue to move forward with the new funding framework, which we announced in February, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Ellerslie.
Mr. Speaker, small businesses are struggling right now. Many have had to reduce hours or close their doors altogether, but bills for these businesses keep coming in, and rent is one of the biggest month-to-month costs a small business needs to shoulder. But according to a recent survey of businesses, just over half of small businesses paid or plan to pay full rent for April. Premier, what is this government doing to support small businesses that can't afford their rent?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll reiterate what we said before. Our government has taken many measures to help small businesses, from deferring WCB premiums, deferring education property taxes, deferring corporate tax collection, and many commercial landlords are also offering rent deferrals to tenants, including Choice Reach, which has over 700 properties across Canada and is granting 60-day deferrals to qualifying small businesses and independent tenants. RioCan has a similar policy. The Vice Chairman of CBRE, one of Canada's largest commercial real estate companies, says the scale of the issue meant that almost all landlords have given some sort of rent deferral.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Ellerslie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're hearing from small businesses that deferrals aren't enough. All it does is add to their debt load at a time when they have no revenue coming in. And many have said that they can't wait for the federal support that could still be at least 6 weeks away. Businesses need cash in hand now. They're crying out for immediate support, such as rent subsidies. Our opposition endorsed this idea in a short-term action plan earlier today. Will the government agree to support these businesses by providing rent subsidies, yes or no?
The Honourable the Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further reliefs that have been offered, for example, for ATB customers, they can apply for payment deferral on loans and lines of credit for up to 6 months. They can access additional working capital for ATB customers. Other ATB business and agriculture customers can access support on a one-on-one basis. As I've mentioned, all options are on the table. Our government and my fellow ministers are talking to businesses and tenants and landlords on a regular basis. We will make sure the decisions that we make are informed and based on data and based on valid information.
The Honourable Member.
Mr. Speaker, we know that small businesses represent 95% of all businesses in Alberta. When combined with the not-for-profit sector, this accounts for roughly 50% of all private sector employment in Alberta, or roughly 750,000 people. We need the provincial government to step up and protect 750,000 jobs. We're facing an economic crisis. We can't afford to continue to sit back and watch more Albertans lose their livelihoods. We need bold action, and we need it now. Will this government endorse our action plan to support small businesses right now? Yes or no?
Honourable the Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, it's interesting to hear the members opposite talking about the importance of businesses and supporting small businesses. Some of the first pieces of legislation this government introduced was to support our job creators. We will continue to support job creators. We took immediate action in introducing many measures to support them, and we will continue to find the right balance between introducing timely measures, but measures that are well thought out and based on data.
The honourable member for Edmonton City Centre has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, yesterday, Alberta Health Services published a document called COVID-19 FAQs for the public. On page 3, it says, quote, wearing a non-medical mask may be helpful in protecting others around you. This is because face coverings are another way to cover your mouth and nose to prevent respiratory droplets from contaminating other people or services. Based on this, is it the position of this government, particularly this Premier, that Albertans should consider wearing a non-medical mask if they are in situations where social distancing is not possible?
Mr. Speaker, it's this government's position to follow the medical advice of our medical professionals, and that includes the Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dina Hinshaw, and we will continue to follow the advice of Dr. Hinshaw, as well as the medical officers of health throughout the system, including the Senior Medical Officer of Health for AHS, Dr. Laura McDougall.
For Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, AHS also published a separate document yesterday called COVID-19 FAQs for staff. And that says on page 9, and I quote, personal protective equipment is not required at work for situations where social distancing is not possible with your co-workers. It also instructs frontline healthcare workers to use routine practices when treating patients who don't display any flu-like symptoms. So, to the Premier, why is this government telling Alberta healthcare workers to take fewer precautions than the general public?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, quite frankly, that is completely false. That is AHS and the medical professionals in AHS taking steps to be able to provide communication to their employees and their staff, as well as to other Albertans. And Mr. Speaker, we continue as a government to take the medical advice of our medical professionals throughout this province in AHS, including Dr. Verna Yu, who is the CEO of Alberta Health Services, the Senior Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Laura McDougall, and we look forward to continuing to be able to get their medical advice throughout this pandemic, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, frontline healthcare workers continue to reach out to me with stories of different mask standards from building to building, unit to unit, even manager to manager. And we've heard of seniors in long-term care facilities with the COVID-19 diagnosis being treated by staff without masks. So one has to ask why the member for Calgary-Acadia has taken so long to provide clarity on this crucial issue and why he is not focusing on this important part of his job. Doesn't he and the Premier think that people need clarity on when they should be wearing a mask that could ultimately save lives?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I do not provide medical advice to Albertans or to the staff of AHS, but we are, as a government, going to listen to the medical advice of our Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dina Hinshaw, as well as the medical officers of health throughout the system. We look forward to continuing to get their advice. It's the best advice that we are going to be getting throughout this pandemic. We're going to continue to listen to Dr. Hinshaw and the rest of our medical professionals in the system, and making sure that Albertans and the staff of AHS are going to be able to get their advice as we make our way through this pandemic, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cardston-Siksika has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We can all agree that the coronavirus pandemic is an aggressive, fast-moving threat. Each day the situation changes and our province will have to rise to these occasions with the most appropriate response from public safety despite opposition from the NDP, Alberta's first interim government. The Minister of Education has announced that all K-12 classes will be cancelled. My question for the Minister of Education, are there virtual options for schools now that in-person classes have been cancelled?
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member for the question. School authorities across this great province are working hard and are quickly adapting to our new reality. Alternative learning plans include online and virtual learning options, but also include paper course packages. Our priority is to ensure every student continues to receive teacher-directed learning, including students without access to technology or to the internet.
The Honourable Member for Cardston-Siksika.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Minister, for the answer and your tremendous work. Given that in-person teaching has been cancelled indefinitely in response to the coronavirus threat, and given that many students have access to computers at home, and given that many classrooms use some technology in teaching, again, to the Minister of Education, what supports, if any, are being provided to school boards to assist in alternate learning arrangements for students?
The Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our education continuity plan was developed in consultation with the Alberta School Boards Association and the College of Alberta School Superintendents and the Alberta Teachers Association. We have been actively working with school authorities across this province as they adapt to meet the needs of their students. My office has also been in constant communication with education stakeholders, including the ASBA, about the challenges our schools are facing. These are unprecedented times, and I want to thank our school authorities for demonstrating leadership and working day in and day out to shift their operations to meet our new at-home learning reality.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister, for the answer. Given that I'm going to ask this question despite heckling from Edmonton Whitemud and Edmonton Gold Bar, and given that the grading is an important metric to understanding how students are learning, and given that the coronavirus is disrupting assessments for students at an unprecedented degree, and given that no students should be penalized for having classes canceled in the wake of global crisis, to the Minister of Education, how will students be graded for this term now that classes have been canceled?
The Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the question, and thank you again to the Honourable Member. Parents and students can be assured that every student will receive a final grade and they will not be penalized because of the cancellation of in-person classes. Teachers are still expected to assess a student's progress, and every student who is on track to progress to the next grade will do so. Students on track for 100 or more credits will still be eligible to graduate and will receive their high school diploma. I want to thank all of our students for their patience and understanding as we all adapt to this new reality in our education system.
Hold on. The Honourable the Member for Calgary Mountain View has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While we recognize the critical need to prevent the spread of COVID, we also need to ensure that the privacy of Albertans is protected. The Premier's claim that he will use unspecified wireless technology to track those under quarantine orders is causing serious confusion and concern. The Office of the Privacy Commissioner yesterday said about the plan, quote, "The Commissioner expects to be consulted on various initiatives being explored by the Government of Alberta." Will the Justice Minister assure the House that before this app is created and deployed, it will receive a full public review by the Privacy Commissioner?
The Honourable the Minister of Justice and the Solicitor General.
Mr. Speaker, our department continues to work closely with Alberta Health Services throughout this COVID pandemic, Mr. Speaker. They are regularly consulting with the legal counsel through our department to make sure that the right decisions are made, Mr. Speaker. We'll make sure that we comply with the law here in the province of Alberta.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the Privacy Commissioner said, quote, "Any option being considered is sure to have privacy implications that would require reasonable safeguards to protect personal or health information," and given that Professor Tom Keenan of the University of Calgary said, quote, there are questions like who gets access to the data and how long it is retained. Can the Minister of Justice confirm that these serious and valid concerns around the use and retention of data will be addressed prior to these measures being put into place?
The Honourable the Minister of Justice and the Solicitor General.
Mr. Speaker, again, as I mentioned earlier on, our department will continue to work with Alberta Health Services to make sure that we have appropriate response to reasonable steps necessary to protect individuals' privacy as well.
Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister for that answer. Given that this government is asking Albertans to trust them with sensitive data from an unknown program that tracks every move they make, And given the government's challenges in keeping a website running to provide emergency financial support to Albertans, and given this Premier's tendency to make bold claims that he cannot always follow through on, how is the public supposed to be assured that this data will be handled appropriately?
The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, like anything that this government does, we have to make sure that we comply with the rules and the laws of our province, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to do that, Mr. Speaker. The other side of there is laughing right now. We're talking about a COVID pandemic, Mr. Speaker. That's ridiculous, and shame on them for that step right now. Shame on them for that, Mr. Speaker. That's ridiculous. We're answering a reasonable question right now, and they're heckling. That's unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. Shame on them. We'll continue to comply with the law in the province of Alberta, Mr. Speaker, and take reasonable steps.
It's a joke. Member for Cal Edmonton Gold Bar.
A number of landowners have reached out to me to say that they were deeply concerned by the minister passing the Liabilities Management Statute Amendment Act under the cover of a global pandemic. They're worried that the changes further limit their rights and will prolong conflicts about well cleanups. The legislation appears to turn the Orphan Well Association into an oil and gas operator. To the Minister of Energy, will landowners now have to wait forever for their land to be cleaned up while the government operates its own oil and gas company on their land?
The Honourable the Minister of Environment and Parks.
Mr. Speaker, we're excited about the work the Energy Minister has done with the Orphan Wells program, Mr. Speaker. In fact, one of the components that she has put within the legislation that has come into this place and into the process going forward is a mechanism for landowners to actually be able to prioritize wells on their sites to be cleaned up, Mr. Speaker, something that landowners have asked for a long time. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, we have a situation across the province, orphan wells that need to be cleaned up. We also have an opportunity within that problem of being able to create work, Mr. Speaker, for contractors, something I know the NDP have often been against oil and gas contractors. Rest assured, this government's going to get that job done.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Given that landowners hope to have a say when their land is going to be cleaned up, and given that the recent legislation does nothing to give landowners avenues to speed up reclamation on their land, and given that this might increase the potential for more legal conflict between landowners, producers, and the Orphan Well Association, and given that this government loves to hand out political favours like candy at a county fair, to the Minister, will you commit to the people of Alberta that money from the Orphan Well Fund will be independently managed and spent only on the basis of science that dictates environmental priorities and not spent to win favours and political support?
The Honourable the Minister of Environment and Parks.
Mr. Speaker, everything, like from my perspective, normal from that honourable member, that's just completely ridiculous. The reality is, yes, there will be a process for landowners to be able to identify wells that they want clean and be able to move them up within the priority of the process. We'll make sure that happens, Mr. Speaker. But what that member just kind of hinted at, and this again was a member who stood on the steps of this legislature and protested with Extinction Rebellion, is the fact that he continues to hate the oil and gas industry and will do everything he can to stop the Alberta government from doing everything we can to make sure the oil and gas industry succeeds because our country needs it.
The Honourable Member.
Given that landowners were not consulted about the changes in Bill 12, and many do not feel that the bill addresses their concerns at all, and given that this government, and particularly my good friend, the government House Leader, seem committed to use the cover of a global pandemic to ram their agenda through with no public accountability, and given that they have probably gone too far on Bill 12, and now their own supporters are turning on them, will the Minister go back to the drawing board, consult with landowners, and work on a solution that respects their rights and promotes their interests?
The Honourable the Minister of Environment and Parks.
Mr. Speaker, I spoke to lots of constituents who are landowners in the last few days. They're excited about the process that we're bringing forward and excited about the fact that we're going to get to work dealing with orphan wells inside this province, Mr. Speaker. That honourable member, when he was in government, did absolutely nothing when it came to that file, Mr. Speaker. But again, to the point, what you're seeing right there from the member from Edmonton Gold Bar is his continued attack on the oil and gas industry. He doesn't want us to succeed. He doesn't want the oil and gas industry to come back. He does not want our industry to move forward, Mr. Speaker, because again, he's been protesting with organizations like Extinction Rebellion and trying to shut down our largest industry.
The Honourable Member for Drumheller-Stettler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, our government introduced Bill 8, Protecting Survivors of Human Trafficking Act. Bill 8 puts in place measures such as giving survivors the ability to sue traffickers, giving police the authority to take action to rescue survivors, and creating a provincial day of awareness. Given that human trafficking and exploitation affects so many in Alberta, including far too many women, children, and girls, to the Minister of Justice, what will our Justice Department and law enforcement do with this additional authority to stop the heinous acts of human trafficking from happening in our province?
The Minister of Justice and Solicitor General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. We simply have to keep vulnerable Albertans safe, Mr. Speaker. It's just as important now in a pandemic as it is in any time, Mr. Speaker, to keep them safe. What this bill would do, it'll provide emergency protection orders, greater ability to get that done, Mr. Speaker, than currently exists under the law. It'll also give the police the ability to get expedited warrants for this type of a situation that, as it relates to human trafficking, Mr. Speaker. We simply have to do more. We have to have a focused effort. That's what this does.
Honourable Member for Drumheller-Stettler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the last 2 days, we've heard much debate about Bill 8, and even though we've made little progress, I still believe everyone in this chamber knows that this bill is needed. This legislation was inspired by 90 incidents of human trafficking in Alberta reported between 2009 and 2016. Given that there is a significant possibility of many unreported cases of human trafficking in our province, to the Minister of Justice, can Albertans expect to hear of more unreported cases of human trafficking in Alberta? And if so, what would the number look like?
Minister of Justice and Solicitor General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This legislation is so key to bring attention to this important issue, Mr. Speaker. We need to make sure that Albertans are confident that the law will be there for them when they need it. For those that are the most vulnerable, Mr. Speaker, that they know they can come forward with confidence that their case will be handled properly, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're trying to do here with this bill. Have a focused effort, have consistent protocols, consistent definitions, Mr. Speaker, and be a leader in the country on this important issue.
The Honourable Member for Drumheller-Stettler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that preventing human trafficking and bringing those criminals to justice relies on information from bystanders and informants, and given that reporting human trafficking is dangerous and can be deadly to victims and witnesses, and that Albertans may be afraid of reporting human trafficking, especially if there is a risk of retaliation, to the Minister of Justice, what can Albertans do to safely stop human trafficking in our province and help bring those criminals to justice?
The Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We need to come together as a province. This isn't something that just simply happens over there, Mr. Speaker. It happens right here in our province to our children, to our young people, Mr. Speaker, and for people of all ages. We have to step up. We have to do more as a government, and we need to raise awareness around this. That's why we're going to have February 22nd as Human Trafficking Awareness Day, Mr. Speaker. We need to come together as a province to make sure we snuff out this deplorable practice, Mr. Speaker. Come together and have a clear message. Not in Alberta, not now, not ever.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The N95 mask is a commonly used item on construction and industrial sites. Many contractors use them to protect their workers from dust and aerosol chemicals. We know that some private construction sites across Alberta are slowing or suspending their work, and this means the supply of these masks and other PPE is sitting idle. Has the Ministry of Infrastructure conducted an inventory of N95 masks in the construction and industrial sectors that could be redeployed to the healthcare or social service delivery industries?
The Honourable the Minister of Infrastructure is rising.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member from Edmonton South for that suggestion. I talked to industry associations and advocacy groups about their safety protocols and all. They said they're all equipped adequately, but I didn't ask them if they have more than they need. I'll go back and check with them if they can spare their surplus to protect our frontline healthcare workers. We'll implement that. But I would like to thank the member for his suggestion.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, given that Alberta's needs for masks will continue to rise as we head into fire season, and given that the absence of clear advice from the member for Calgary-Arcadia will drive up public demand for masks and PPE of all types, including the masks currently on construction sites, and is the Ministry of Infrastructure monitoring this privately held inventory to ensure it doesn't slip away while the member for Calgary-Arcadia dithers?
The Honourable the Minister of Infrastructure.
I don't see why he's trying to take a shot at Minister of Health there, but I will work with the member opposite, and I'll also consult the Minister of Health. And if infrastructure contractors have any surplus PPE, we will support AHS frontline workers.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the Public Health Act gives the government the authority and the ability to use a wide range of powers to respond to this pandemic, and given that the UCP has also granted itself extraordinary powers to do anything it wants under Bill 10, and given that we need these masks at the front lines, and projections indeed show we will run out of these masks, why is the government being so slow to act and take additional measures on assembling this province's inventory of N95 masks?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation has risen.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know why the honourable member is picking on construction workers. We need to keep all Albertans safe. Yeah, we need to keep our frontline healthcare workers safe. It's not either or, Mr. Speaker. It's both. All Albertans. The honourable member didn't even ask to take inventory to see if there was enough before he wants to take valuable safety equipment away from Alberta workers. Why does the NDP not care about people that are actually doing all kinds of work, including healthcare workers and including others?
Of order has been noted at 2:20, and we are on the Honourable Member for Edmonton Whitemud.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For families across Alberta, the necessary shutdown of childcare centres during this pandemic has made it incredibly challenging for many of them to be able to work. I hope that it has also made it clear to this government that childcare is an essential service that Albertans need access to. The Minister of Children's Services had a call with childcare centres on Monday, and once again they are left with more questions than answers and zero commitments of the concrete support they urgently need. What is the holdup? When is the minister going to step up to support our childcare operators so that they are there for Albertans when we're all able to go back to work?
The Minister of Education is rising.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. On behalf of the Minister of Children's Services, I want to reiterate that the decision to close childcare centres was made on the advice of the Chief Medical Officer of Health to protect the health and safety of all Albertans. And as the Minister has said before, she has held 4 town halls with childcare operators now and will continue to do that as she moves forward. The intention, of course, is always to support the centres once the situation is stabilized, and I know she's working really, really hard to enact that and work with that.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Whitemud.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 4 town halls, but no concrete answers. Given that rather than standing up for Alberta childcare providers, the minister seems to prefer the idea of waiting for the federal Liberals to provide support, which is a common theme with this government. And given that I was copied on a letter to the minister that 14 childcare organizations representing private and nonprofit operators and early childhood educators sent, which laid out a simple and concrete request for a temporary emergency operating allowance based on money that is already in the budget. To the minister, are you prepared to do your job, stop waiting for Ottawa, and actually support Alberta's childcare operators?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would just like to share on behalf of the Minister of Children's Services that we now have around 4,000 spaces for children of all essential workers. We've also established a process with AUMA and RMA to add new locations as spaces based on demonstrated need. And while we're keeping in contact with the Chief Medical Officer and ensuring that all is done in as safe a manner as possible, these are incredibly difficult times, and the Minister of Children's Services is responding in a very timely manner.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That question wasn't even related, or that answer wasn't even related to the question I asked. So given that BC has given childcare centres the ability to repurpose already budgeted but unused funds towards covering costs during the pandemic, and given that the minister has the capacity in her budget to support these organizations, it's just that she's chosen not to yet, and given that once the pandemic is over, Albertans will need access to reliable and affordable childcare to get back to work, and given that in order to fulfill this essential purpose, centres will need to still exist in order to reopen, will the minister commit to this simple and direct request to save our childcare centres?
Might remind the member for Edmonton Whitemud that preambles are also not allowed in question period. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'd like to extend my gratitude on behalf of the Minister of Children's Services to the daycare centre staff and their operators that have stepped up to provide an important service during emergency time periods to help in the fight against this pandemic.
The goal has always been very clear that when our economy recovers, we will need a viable childcare sector to contribute to it. And right now, there's just too much flux to say what will ultimately be the best way to do that. But I know the Minister of Children's Services is continuing to work really, really hard on this particular piece.
Good answer.
The honourable member for Calgary West has a question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Alberta has been faced with a pandemic that is, of course, unprecedented. Our first responders have been working around the clock, walking into this unknown, invisible enemy. Now, while many are staying indoors to avoid exposure at all costs, our first responders have been responding to calls to service regardless of the risk. So, to the Minister of Health, have there been any additional boots on the ground since this pandemic has begun?
Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Paramedics in this province are dispatched through a standardized process, and that includes COVID-19 screening. This ensures that paramedics are going into a scene, when they go into a scene, that they are safe and they have the appropriate PPE. And every day in Alberta, there are more than 1,000 calls to EMS for emergency issues. Typically around 65% of those events result in patient transport. Every EMS unit is equipped with a full supply of the necessary PPE to care for the potential patients, including eye protection, gloves, gowns, and masks, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Calgary West.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Now, given that Alberta Health Services was in a hiring freeze prior to the outbreak, and given that there is a paramedic class graduating right now from SAIT in Calgary who are unable to write the registration exams until the fall, to the same minister, are there any plans to fast-track these exams so that we have more paramedics on duty to respond to calls to service?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The regulatory colleges set the requirements for graduation, and the colleges have not changed the requirements at this time. The requirements are to ensure the safety of all Albertans. AHS does have guidelines, guiding principles in place regarding student placements. Their top priority is the care and safety of patients, clients, and residents, Mr. Speaker.
Member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Now, given that in my riding of Calgary West, where there are many seniors facilities, and given that the elderly have been categorized as high risk of contracting COVID-19, and given that we want to avoid a paramedic shortage, Mr. Speaker, can the minister, the same minister, please comment on strategies that we're implementing to protect our elderly and the paramedics responding to the emergent situations?
The Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Ministry and AHS are working closely to protect the health of EMS and the patients that they support. All paramedics are being screened under a standardized process before they enter a seniors facility. I should also note that there is no noted shortages of paramedics in Calgary at this time. It's essential that anyone who is COVID-19 positive and needing urgent medical attention should notify 911 operators of this when they call. Additionally, all paramedics are required to perform a point-of-care risk assessment when they arrive so they can determine if PPE is required.
The honourable member for St. Albert.
During times of emergency and crisis, it's always the most vulnerable Albertans who are in the greatest danger. Yet, Albertans on income support and those receiving AISH didn't qualify for the Government of Alberta's emergency isolation support, despite many calls and letters to the Minister for Community and Social Services. Now that the provincial emergency assistance has abruptly ended, will the minister follow BC's lead and provide a monthly $300 supplement to those receiving assistance and disability payments who are not eligible for federal programs?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. AISH income is still in place within our province, Mr. Speaker. That will still continue. As the minister has said in the House already, very clearly, AISH payments will continue. There are other mechanisms as well to help those who are on AISH within our system that the minister has spoken about many times inside this chamber, Mr. Speaker. The isolation support was for people who have lost their income, and I'm proud to say that AISH income has not been lost inside this province, and the Alberta government continues to pay AISH, Mr. Speaker. So that will continue, and the honourable member should stop fear-mongering inside the Assembly.
The honourable member for St. Albert.
Given that the minister should pay attention to the question to be able to answer it. Many Albertans on AISH or income support also work part-time to make ends meet. And given these Albertans are at high risk during a pandemic, they have no choice but to self-isolate, which has resulted in lost wages. To the minister, given that they will have to apply for employment insurance and the $2,000 federal emergency funding, but any federal support they receive is all automatically deducted from their monthly provincial assistance. Will you exempt federal benefits from being counted as income and clawed back? It's actually quite a simple question.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, AISH income remains in place inside the province. In regards to isolation support, that program was being used for different purposes, Mr. Speaker. AISH income will continue to be paid. There are other mechanisms within the government that the Honourable Minister of Community and Social Services has spoken about many times in this chamber. If the Honourable Member would like to learn more about that, she's welcome to contact the Minister, who I know, Mr. Speaker, will be happy to take her through it. But through you, Mr. Speaker, to those who are on AISH, I want to assure them that Alberta government will continue with AISH payments going forward, and that's not going to change.
The Honourable Member.
Given that disabled and low-income Albertans were already struggling before the pandemic, let's be clear, single people on income support get under $900 a month. And given they're now in isolation and further grinding poverty, to the minister, why don't you show some compassion, help vulnerable Albertans apply for the federal supports without fear that their benefits will be clawed back? They're struggling, they're isolated, they just want to know that these benefits won't be clawed back. Simple answer, yes or no.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I and nobody from the government will be lectured by that member when it comes to compassion. That member stayed up last night till 4 o'clock in the morning attempting to filibuster a bill that helps those who have been humanly trafficked, Mr. Speaker. That honourable member has no right, from my perspective, to stand in this House and in any way lecture anybody on compassion, Mr. Speaker, after that shameful behaviour last night, Mr. Speaker. In fact, from my perspective, it's totally up to her. She should stand up in this House and apologize for her behaviour last night, Mr. Speaker. But what I want really everybody to know, Mr. Speaker, is even her constituents to know that Alberta government will continue to defend them in the days to come.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Buffalo.
Mr. Speaker, this government likes to refer to municipalities as their partners and suggests they have the back of Alberta's municipalities during this pandemic and economic crisis. Despite today's infrastructure announcement, municipalities are still reeling from the cuts and downloading that they have already seen from this government and will continue to see as a result of the government's fiscal plan. Will the Minister of Municipal Affairs commit to freezing, reversing, or cancelling all downloading and cuts to municipalities for the duration of this crisis?
The Honourable the Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had the pleasure after our infrastructure announcement today to talk about to the head of RMA and the head of AUMA and the mayors of Calgary and Edmonton, and as best as I could tell from the phone call that they are happy with our announcement today. They're looking forward to other supports if we can work with them on some other infrastructure things as time goes on. And I assured them that we will take their considerations, their requests into consideration as we go forward. And I think at this point we're in a pretty good place, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Buffalo.
Thank you for the answer, and other supports are needed. Given that the UCP agreed with our caucus's proposal to increase stimulus funding for infrastructure, as well as to reverse the 4.2% increase to municipalities' education property taxes, but given that even despite this, municipalities are telling me and my colleagues that it's not enough. Specifically, will the Minister of Municipal Affairs commit to reversing the 50% reduction to the grants in place of taxes or GPOT program, which is tens of millions of dollars of the province not paying its own taxes downloaded onto Alberta's municipalities?
The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I had the pleasure of meeting with RMA yesterday and AUMA today. Both of those organizations indicated their strong support for the direction the government is going, and thanked the Alberta government for the work so far, and they're going to continue to work with us, Mr. Speaker. Interestingly enough, though, we have municipalities who've been asking for the Emergency Management Act to pass this chamber, Mr. Speaker, and there is significant concerns from municipalities that member and his caucus continue to filibuster that legislation inside this place, Mr. Speaker. So if the member truly wants to support the Alberta government helping municipalities, that's one thing that he can do, is break the filibuster and stand up for his mayors.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Buffalo.
and you can support an amendment we have on the floor, and perhaps we'll get there. Given that during these difficult times, our municipal workers have shown their dedication and commitment to Alberta, and given that so many of them are standing up for Alberta, our provincial government needs to stand in support of those municipal workers with meaningful actions. Will the Minister of Municipal Affairs commit today to push for funding for our municipalities so that every essential municipal services worker can access free childcare during this pandemic if they need it?
The Honourable, the Minister of Finance and the President of Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. One thing I can say that this government will do, our Premier announced today that we are going forward with by doubling our infrastructure spend on capital maintenance and renewal for 2020. Mr. Speaker, that's an additional $1 billion in job creation on projects that will matter to future Albertans, Mr. Speaker, projects where workers can find meaningful work, and on projects, Mr. Speaker, that will position this province for the recovery when that arrives.
The Honourable Member for Lacombe-Panoka has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The supply system for grocery stores has remained strong and steady. And still, some Albertans are afraid that supplies could run out, leaving essential stores empty. Thankfully, we have truckers working day and night to safely restock supplies. As this pandemic continues to restrict travel and increase social distancing, to the Minister of Transportation, how have truckers been impacted by the restricted travel caused by this pandemic?
The Honourable, the Minister of Transportation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've been working closely with our truck drivers, the Alberta Motor Transport Association and the different companies, and they have had trouble getting sanitary supplies, getting food on the road, having a place to sleep. We're making progress. We got more work to do, but we have more and more restaurants stepping up that will serve truck drivers without them going through the drive-through. We're putting in more bathroom facilities on weigh scales and other provincial places where we're adding roadside truck stops. But we're not finished yet, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Lacombe-Panoka.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that we rely on truckers to be able to replenish our stores and restock shelves, and given that legislation in both countries, the United States and Canada, have restricted non-essential travel, and given that this may impact truckers' ability to cross borders and replenish our stores and shelves, to the Minister of Transportation, with restrictions at borders, can Albertans still count on truckers to be able to continue to do their job?
Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, Albertans can always count on truckers. They're there for us. They're working very hard under difficult circumstances. And some of the hurdles that they've gotten over lately is a threat that they couldn't get insurance on their trucks across the border, that they couldn't get health insurance when they crossed the border. We've worked with our Canadian partners, and those things are available. We've got exemptions where they don't have to stay in isolation for 14 days when they get back, unless, of course, they're sick. That's a different case. So there's been lots of progress made. Our truckers are not the problem. It's with the rest of us making sure that the truckers can do the job that they want to do.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that truckers risk their lives by being on the road and crossing borders, and given that they are one of the most essential services we need to keep our stores replenished and shelves stocked, and given that many Albertans rely on truckers and feel that they want to give thanks to them, to the same minister, how can Albertans support our truckers?
Minister of Transportation.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would say Albertans can encourage the restaurants in their communities to be available to truckers, and in fact, encourage their municipalities. Just today, our government made restrictions or took off restrictions to where truck drivers can park in municipalities. And you know what? The municipalities I talked to today were in favor of that. They know it's a temporary measure, but they want to do what they can for truckers. The other thing, people can post social media, thank a trucker. They can, if you see a trucker stop somewhere, just say thank you and encourage people to offer them the services that they need.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge East.
Mr. Speaker, as the COVID-19 pandemic unfolds, the strict requirements that are necessary to flatten the curve in our province are affecting more and more Albertans. Across the province, people have been forced to stay home to care for children who are no longer attending classes at school or in daycare. Others have been forced to make the difficult choice to stay home to care for a self-isolating dependent, risking losing their livelihood. In such unprecedented times, Albertans deserve assurance that they will not be penalized for staying home to take care of their families. Can the Minister of Labour and Immigration please update this House on what measures have been put in place to increase job security for Albertans forced to stay home?
The Honourable, the Minister of Labour and Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member for the question. Let me say this, Mr. Speaker, Albertans will not be penalized. We are doing everything that we can to protect Albertans during this difficult time. That's why on Monday I announced changes to the Employment Standards Code, which includes unpaid job-protected leave for employees who have to stay at home and look after children due to closure of schools and daycares. This also applies to employees caring for ill or self-isolated family member due to COVID-19. The leave applies to anyone who needed to stay home for those reasons on or after March 17th. No one should have to choose between looking after their family.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for his answer. Given that many industries have been particularly hard hit by the necessary measures of the COVID-19 response, and given that employers have had to make the extremely difficult decision to temporarily lay off staff in order to survive the weeks to come, to the same Minister, how is the government planning on helping Albertans get back to work and resume their day-to-day work after this pandemic?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know a number of businesses have made the difficult decision to lay off employees, and we know this isn't easy. We want to ensure that every temporarily laid off worker can stay attached to their job during this pandemic for as long as possible. And that is why on Monday we announced changes to the Employment Standards Code that for an individual who's laid off on a temporary basis, that will be from 60 to 120 days, the duration. And this change is retroactive for any temporary layoff prior to March 17th. And Mr. Speaker, we want to help Albertans get back to work quickly once the recovery starts.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you again to the Minister for his response. Given that the COVID-19 pandemic is an emergency that has rapidly evolved over the past month, and given that recent projections show that social distancing measures will need to be in place for several months yet to come in order to keep Albertans safe, and given that this important adjustment requirements around employment and job protection throughout the public health crisis, to the same Minister, what other measures are being considered to increase flexibility for employers and employees both during this public health crisis?
The Honourable, the Minister of Labour and Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As this situation continues to evolve, we are making sure to adapt and do everything that we can to help Alberta employees and employers. We've heard from businesses that they've had some difficulty under the employment standards, and that is why, Mr. Speaker, we made a number of changes to allow flexibility so that employers can work with employees to ensure that they deliver the key services that Albertans need during this pandemic. In addition, we've also streamlined the variance process so that if there is going to be further changes that are required, we can do this quickly and ensure that the critical services and the essential services that Albertans need today can be delivered.
Honourable members, we are at points of order, and I'm both pleased and mildly regretted that both points of order have been withdrawn. And so as such, we are at orders of the day, orders du jour. Horner.
Committee of the Whole.
afternoon, all you cool cats and kittens. I would like to call Committee of the Whole to order. Committee of the Whole has under consideration Bill 13, the Emergency Management Amendment Act 2020, number 2. We are on Amendment A2. Are there any speakers to the amendment? The Honourable Member for Calgary-Buffalo.
Madam Chair, I put this amendment, and this is my first time to get to speak to it. Earlier this morning, I was briefed by the Minister of Municipal Affairs with regard to his preparations in his ministry with regard to COVID-19. I appreciate that opportunity to have those discussions. But as was mentioned by the House Leader earlier, we have before us an opportunity to come together as a legislature and to look at what's in the best interests of Alberta's municipalities and Albertans, frankly, because of the pandemic that we're dealing with. And obviously, there's no issue with changing one part of this Amendment Bill 13, which talks about taking away the influenza in front of pandemic, so it's more general in scope and speaks to all potential kinds of pandemic, which will be different than the novel COVID virus in the future. But the amendment that I'm speaking to is the striking out of Section 8 on page 3 of the amendment document bill. And specifically, Madam Chair, it is with regard to the line at the bottom of that page that reads 1.02, the minister may, by order, rescind, cancel, or modify any bylaw enacted, resolution passed, action taken, order made, or direction given by a local authority. Local authority, if you look that up in the definitions, means local elected authority, and it could mean the delegated parties that the local authority has put in place with regard to a local emergency. Anyway, direction given by a local authority during the state of a local emergency. And it's that item in particular, in my feeling, that that's an overreach by this minister. He has powers in other parts of the EMA that he repeatedly points out to members of this side in Section 22. So he has powers already to take many, many actions. I don't see the purpose, and our side does not see the purpose of restating that power again, particularly when he already has the hammer, as it were. If he wanted to put something in here, and he wanted the support and agreement of the loyal opposition, he potentially could look at changing his 1.02 to say it's done in consultation with local authorities. So the overreach is not allowed indiscriminately, that there's a discussion between local authorities and the Minister of Municipal Affairs. But repeatedly, he's not seen the wisdom of working in concert. And my question today in question period, Madam Chair, was, you know, this government likes to say that it's got the backs of municipalities. And the answer from various ministers was, we do. We work in concert with municipalities. Well, if you work in concert with municipalities, why don't you put it in writing instead of finding that there's pushback from those same municipalities who feel that this is an overreach by the Minister of Municipal Affairs? And so the amendment's not long. Of course, it's the striking out of that section, but that seems to be the only way we can get the attention of the minister. Seems to be the only way we can suggest a change to the document. You know, I'm speaking on behalf of my colleagues here, but if this was amended by government to say, okay, number 1.02 will say in the future, the minister may, by order, rescind, cancel, or modify any bylaw enacted, resolution passed, action taken, order made, or, flip the page, direction in consultation with local authorities during the state of a local emergency. I could support that. The thing is that many of these large cities, Edmonton, Calgary, they know what they're doing with regard to a local emergency. They've been through it before. They have pushed back floodwaters in 2005 in Calgary, in 2013 in Calgary. They have acted in the best interest of hundreds of thousands of people in that city who were affected by the 2013 flood. The largest, at that point in 2013, it was the largest natural disaster any city in Canada has ever experienced. It was billions of dollars. And that was done under the direction of CEMA, the Calgary Emergency Management Authority. Why would CEMA give up its authority to this minister when they've got the track record, they've got the abilities, working in concert and together with the province of Alberta, the government of Alberta, is the way to go. It's worrisome, Madam Chair, that this minister does not see the benefit of 4 or 5 small words in that part of the bill that would make the whole difference. It would improve it from the perspective, my perspective, our government, our opposition's perspective, and I believe the City of Calgary's perspective. I think they were surprised, Madam Chair, with that overreach, that line inserted in particular. And I can understand why they would be. Now, the City of Edmonton also has a wonderful emergency management authority. I have not got the same concern identified by representatives of that city with regard to this part of the bill. And fair enough. You know, they've got a number of other things that are on their plate right now. Canvassing broadly the municipalities throughout the other 5 large city municipalities in Alberta, and the scores of others is not something I could do, because this bill was brought here Tuesday, and we are Thursday. So this side has looked at it and made some recommendations to improve the bill. And I believe it's in the interests of the city that I represent, the portion of the city I represent, I come from, to work in partnership with that city instead of being didactic and saying this is the way it's going to be. I think a coming together, a working together is what's in the interest. And that's what should happen during any emergency, Madam Chair. All of the levels of government should work together hand in glove. And I'm happy to say that they have in the past. The 2013 flood could not have been properly addressed. And I can remember photo ops with the Prime Minister of Canada, I believe it was, I don't think it was Premier Prentice. It could have been Premier Redford at that point, and standing with Mayor Nenshi. And they were on the brow of the hill, and they were at Crescent Heights in front of the CEMA building, the new CEMA building that the City of Calgary had built at great expense. And I remember the mayor of the time was Dave Bronconnier, and he said, we have to improve our operations center for our emergency personnel when disasters occur. And it was probably hundreds of millions of dollars to build that center. I was on the council that made the decision to do it because the mayor was still around and I was still around before 2010. And it was far-reaching. It was what we needed to do. And if anyone has been to that center, I can tell you that it's state of the art. It's buried into the ground, 2 or 3 stories. It's totally self-sufficient. Hundreds and hundreds of emergency people can exist, stay there, and work together in comfort and be safe while conducting a major, major operation. And they did that in 2013 to the benefit of Calgarians and the downtown business district that was shut down for 1 full week, Madam Chair. 1 full week, not one person went into the downtown because there was no power. Businesses, there was floodwaters still throughout the downtown, several feet high. And that was managed in cooperation with the government of Alberta and the government of Canada, the recovery efforts. And so it boggles my mind to read this 1.02 and to understand the implications in it, which is the minister, without agreement of the local authority, can change anything he wants to. And that's just not okay for me as a Calgarian, as a former city alderman, city councillor. I would not approve of the minister of the Crown of Alberta taking over and saying the things you have put in place aren't good enough, we want them to be different, and we're not asking you anything. I can do it because it's written right here in black and white. And so that's why we have put the amendment on the floor to strike out Section 8, because that's the only thing that has so far gotten the attention of the other side. If, as I say, there were agreement to take a softer approach, to amend that problematic 3 lines, then I would certainly welcome that. If it were to say in cooperation or in consultation with the local authority during a state of emergency, that would do it, Madam Chair. We think it's important. I think I just want to cover a few other things. Yes, we believe we're being infinitely reasonable in our approach, and the House Leader a few minutes ago was talking about this item and the amount of time it's taken the whole bill to come before us and be debated. And I must say, Madam Chair, when a bill is dropped on, it was either yesterday or the day before, and the expectation is that there'll be 3 readings of that bill within a few hours of us getting it. I don't think it's reasonable. I think it would have been helpful for more of us on this side to have the opportunity to reach out to our elected representatives at the local level and to say, and you've heard this part of the discussion before on different bills. I'm not saying anything unique here. To have the opportunity to consult with stakeholders, meaning local elected officials, is not a terrible thing. It's expected. It's a part of the job. But the expectation that we're living under is that we don't do any of those things. We quickly look at it and give it a nod, saying, thumbs up, let's go. I'm a little wonderstruck at the kind of change in the environment around here, not just because of the pandemic, but I think it's the change in the environment around here as a result of new leadership. The traditions that we have existed under for this legislature has existed under since 1905 or something. Maybe that's the building. I think no, that's Alberta, right? Alberta became its own province in 1905. The building 1911. So those traditions have lasted for a long time, but they don't seem to be ones that people are willing to continue to operate under. So back to this Bill 13, Emergency Amendment Act 2020. I wasn't here for the debate on the original amendment that was put forward, and I understand it wasn't supported. But I do want to underline that the cooperative working arrangements of all orders of government is necessary to tackle even the most benign kind of issues. I know that as a representative, residents often come to me and say they'd like me to do this, that, or the other things on their behalf. And you look at the sharing of power, or how power is kind of dispersed on the different orders of government, and you can't always do what they want, but you can work with your colleagues who are representatives of the Government of Canada or the City of Calgary. And that's how you get things done. That doesn't exist in this part of the bill that I am identifying that should be changed. And if it were to change in that regard, then I don't think there'd be a problem. Of course, I haven't got the Regulations Act in front of me, so I don't know specifically what that is, but I do have the EMA in front of me and have checked Section 22 out, read EMA, as the Minister of Municipal Affairs has urged us to do. This is an amendment to all of that, and what would make this amendment and its adoption for the EMA better is a spirit of cooperation identified in 1.02. So I think, Madam Chair, that with those words said, that I can look to take my seat and perhaps hear from the Minister, if that's possible, or my other colleagues who want to address this part of the amendment that's before us now. Thank you.
Any other members wishing to speak to Amendment A2, the Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I rise once again to speak to the amendment before this Assembly, which essentially seeks to strike Section 8 of Bill 13, and also wants to respond to the comment made by the opposition member from Calgary Buffalo, who also happens to be the critic on our municipal file. Let me say once again, through you, Madam Chair, and for the benefit of viewers who may be watching from home, that this is one amendment that, quite frankly, should not be tabled before this Assembly. But I do understand the concerns and why the member opposite will want to bring this particular amendment before this particular House. I am going to respond in this way. Number one, the powers given to the Minister of Municipal Affairs under the current Emergency Management Act are enormous, much more bigger than the amendments, than Bill 13. And for the benefit of viewers out there, Section 19 and Section 22, all of Section 19 of the Emergency Management Act and Section 22 sub 2 of the Emergency Management Act, when read together, details some of those expansive nature of the powers given to the Minister of Municipal Affairs under a local state of emergency or a state of emergency. Again, to be clear, so that viewers better understand why it is disappointing to have to sit in this particular Assembly to listen to this proposed amendment. Currently, the Minister of Municipal Affairs have got the power given to him by the Emergency Management Act to step in and terminate completely any local state of emergency anywhere in this province. That power was not given to the Minister of Municipal Affairs by this government. That power has been there so long as we have had this act in place in this province. The question then I have for members opposite is, if the Minister of Municipal Affairs have got the authority to terminate completely a local authority, what then are they afraid of to give the Minister of Municipal Affairs the power to step in to modify instead of terminating, which essentially what this is all about? And by the way, Calgary, Edmonton, Red Deer, and the AUMA agrees with us. And I want to read it. April 8th press release by the AUMA, which is the organization that the member opposite ought to be speaking with and listening to. April 8th, and I read, I quote, Alberta's municipalities and the Alberta Urban Municipality Association fully support the provincial government's April 7 announcement about amending the Emergency Management Act. The April 7 amendment is Bill 13. The extension of local states of emergency for up to 90 days are a necessary step to respond to Alberta's evolving situation. Now, here is the interesting part with respect to the amendment to strike Section 8 of Bill 13. They wrote, and I quote, we also expect that providing the Minister of Municipal Affairs with the power to modify a state of emergency without terminating it would remove unnecessary red tape during this time of uncertainty due to the COVID-19 pandemic. What else are they arguing about if not for petty politics? What else do they want from this bill? I am saying that, I would prefer to work with our municipalities, which is what they expect from us, rather than me having to step in to terminate or end the whole of the local state of emergency, which I'm sure the member opposite would never disagree is a legal right given to the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Again, if not for, petty politics, which is, unfortunately, has been the attitude of the members opposite with respect to any conceivable bill. We are in an unprecedented time having to deal with this COVID-19 pandemic that is tasking all of government. All of government. We have deployed all of government assets and resources and the full time of all of my colleagues in cabinet to make sure that we protect our people across this province. And the municipalities came to us and said, in order for them to have the tool to better respond to this pandemic, please give us this, i.e., Calgary, Edmonton, Red Deer, and AUMA. Give us this. We are not the author, we are not the originator of Bill 13. It came from Edmonton, Calgary, Red Deer, with the support of AUMA. And by the way, I have always, because I fundamentally believe in the Westminster parliamentary tradition, I have always made that time to brief my critic. In fact, this afternoon, we spent more than almost half an hour or more to brief him on the entire municipal affairs response to COVID-19. I also took the time to brief him ahead of time before the tabling of this bill. And hear this. He did not raise any question on Section 8. So, again, I understand the nature of politics. I get it. But at this point in time, the people of our province are going through some difficult time. We don't need to add any additional anxiety or headache on them. We ought to be focused on how do we make life a little bit easier for them. And those who have the responsibility, by the way, to make use of this provision are telling us that they welcome it, that is what they want. That would help them further their work. This afternoon, or this morning, I alluded to their previous amendment to strike the requirement for up to 90 days. And I said just yesterday, I received the notices of this weekly renewal from Edmonton and Calgary. This added paperwork when they should be focusing on addressing the pandemic needs of their citizens. Why should we ever think of that? Why should we allow this paperwork and time and the resources needed to call council to do this when we have the urgent need to keep our people safe? So, members, the honorable members of this chamber, you have before you an amendment to Bill 13 that should never, in the first instance, made it to the floor of this particular house if the members opposite are serious about having a substantive conversation with respect to Bill 13. And as you have heard, all of our urban municipalities support this Bill 13. I have no clue whom the members opposite are speaking with. And the amendment, the bill that we have put forward does not in any way seek to enlarge. Let me be clear, for the benefit of our viewers out there at home. I have not given any additional power that I don't have the power to terminate. Far more is greater than the power to modify. I already have that particular power. I really don't need this. But the reason why this is important is because in a state of pandemic, you want to make sure that our municipalities and the province are working together. The province already have got those powers. We want better coordination. We want our response to be in line with that of our municipal partners. That is what our people expect from us. They want to make sure that their government is functional, that their elected leaders are responding to their needs, and that whether you are in government or in the opposition, that in this critical point of time in our history, that we are all working together, not to debate an amendment that runs contrary to what they will expect from us. So with that, the honorable members, I urge all of you to vote down this amendment. Thank you.
I see the honourable member for Calgary West.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I certainly I just seek a little bit of clarification from the minister. And I apologize. I myself am certainly, I was only a sergeant with the Calgary Police Service. My friend here was only, with the Edmonton Police Service. My friend over here only has his master's degree in social work. My friend over here only has his doctorate. So we may not be as learned as the folks across from us. So I just want some clarification here from the minister. So what you're saying is that the municipalities would be opposed to this amendment that is being presented by the member from Calgary Buffalo. And I just want to be clear as well in that the municipalities are the ones that have requested this bill that is before us right now. So really any sort of delay in this would be going against the wishes of the municipalities. And I apologize because, again, I just may not be understanding this. So maybe they can expand on that. Thank you.
Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you to the member from Calgary West. The member is absolutely correct. I have just read a news release by the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association, confirming that indeed they would welcome.
Honourable members. Honourable member for Calgary West. No crossing talk along the benches here. Sorry, Honourable Minister, please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Madam Chair was saying that the member from Calgary West is absolutely correct. This Bill 13 was a request by two of our biggest municipalities, Edmonton and Calgary, and Red Deer joined them. And as you've also heard me read the press release in support of this particular bill and every aspect of the contentious part. By the way, all of the part that the AUMA supports are all of the amendments that the members opposite have offered to delete from this bill. So the question for them is, who are they working for? Are they working for our municipalities, or are they working for their special interest beholders? Who are they working for? Are they working for the people? The elected council in Calgary represents the residents of Calgary Buffalo. And through that elected council, they have made their request, and I will appreciate that the member opposite will respect the wishes of his residents in Calgary Buffalo. That's what they have asked us to do, and that's exactly what we have given them. And as I said, the current provisions of the Emergency Management Act give the Minister of Municipal Affairs enormous power, including the power to conscript in a time of pandemic. It's right there, Section 19. Take a look. So if the minister have got that particular power and the power to terminate, what are they afraid about a provision that says you could modify rather than ending the whole thing? And, all they need to do is to talk to Calgary, talk to Edmonton, talk to Red Deer, talk to the AUMA, and I'm sure they have. And I'm sure that the members opposite have followed up with the AUMA. And I'm sure they have seen this press release. But that's not good enough, because for them, it's all about gotcha politics. We have a responsibility to do the work of the people that send us here. And this is one rare occasion where we ask for unity. Unity to tackle this pandemic and make sure that residents and communities and our partners at the local government level have got the tools that they need. The province have got the powers already to deal with a provincial state of emergency or a local state of emergency. What we are looking to do here is to make sure that, again, we collaborate and reason with and work with our municipal partners. And one last point. They want to frame this thing as giving the UCP-led government a massive, overreaching, powerful power. This is coming from a government, by the way, that believes in big government. I mean, a political party that believed in big government. Take a look at every political party in the world's philosophies. They are the ones that fundamentally believe that unless government is big, it doesn't work. They are the ones that want to layers upon layers of regulations and obstacles in the wheels of progress and business. All of a sudden, they became interested in giving the municipalities the tool. It became a concern to them giving the municipality the tool that they have asked for. There's something not right about that, again, if not for gotcha politics. With that, members, once again, I urge you to vote down this amendment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And the members wishing to speak to the amendment, the Honourable Member for Edmonton McClung.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Pleased to rise this afternoon on a Thursday to speak to the amendment to Bill 13A2 and once again attempt to bring the debate home to speak about individuals. The legislation we're debating will ultimately influence and affect intimately and directly. And those people that I speak about, of course, are the municipal leaders whose wings will be clipped by the measure number, or the 8 that we're hoping to strike by our amendment. I'm given to thinking, of course, in reference to remarks made just recently by the Minister of Municipal Affairs, that people turn to government in times of critical emergency. And of course, globally, as the Minister alluded to, people are turning to governments because they see value in government's abilities to respond to the necessities of the society. The most basic level of their responsibility is to protect and preserve the safety and health of the people they're elected by. And of course, that's what's happening globally. And it's giving many, many millions of people around the globe great pause and reflection, reason to reflect upon some of the debate that was taking place before this pandemic struck the world about what the minister was talking about, well, the size and the role of government. And I think this pandemic, one of the lessons from it will be, as a result of that reflection, that people reacquaint themselves with the very reasons that we turn to our civic authorities and to elected officials to show leadership in getting us through times of crisis such as a health pandemic. And that's the very reason that I'm happy to support this amendment, Madam Chair, because I'm thinking exactly what effect this might have on the relationship between the two levels of government. Now, the minister, of course, is very correct in asserting that major powers of termination, complete termination of an emergency measure declared by a municipality exists already. In fact, Madam Chair, the power to completely terminate the existence of a municipality exists within the rubric and the legislation of the province already. But that's not necessarily the relevant fact that we're looking to discuss today. We are fully knowledgeable that municipalities are the creations of the province, and they are a different level of government within the Canadian spectrum, but of course they're not constitutionally established. They were established by statute, and they can be eliminated by statute in their entirety. And in fact, that has happened in some cases where a municipality has become insolvent for whatever reason. And my own little home village of Thorhill, I've mentioned numerous times in this House, was one of those, unfortunately, to suffer that dissolution, and it became a part and parcel of the county rather than an independent village as a result of financial difficulties over a long period of time. So we're certainly aware of the power differential and the legal framework that the province and the municipalities operate under, and where the municipalities are the children of the province, and there certainly exists at the will of the province. But this particular piece of legislation that we're debating today revolves around the ability of the province to not only terminate, but now to additionally tinker with the emergency measures invoked by a municipality. And certainly, as I mentioned, the state of affairs right now is that the provincial government has the power to terminate completely the municipality itself, to terminate the emergency order, But now to go further and ask for a more minute and I would say, I'm searching for the right word, in terms of the feelings that it's going to impose upon the municipalities to go in and adjust and amend the actual orders and dictate how an emergency management order might be fulfilled, or it might be altered, or in fact written in the first place. And that's what I'm actually trying to get at here is, Madam Chair, is what will it cause in terms of the thinking process of municipal authorities when they're looking at creating the terms and details of their emergency measures declarations? Will it create, rather than minimize, a layer of red tape, at least one that might be unseen by the public, but will it not, in the minds of the municipal authorities, create a need to have a second thought every time they decide that they're going to go ahead and make a change to the emergency declaration that they want to draft, or in fact, when they're drafting it or making the decision to go forward with it, will it not force them? And maybe this is what the government hopes it will do. Will it not force them to say, jeepers, we better talk to the province, and should we go ahead with this, or are they just going to slap it down anyways? And thereby creating another level of an unnecessary interaction that won't really cut red tape. In fact, adds another layer of process that doesn't happen right now, where this government and others before it have encouraged the independence of municipalities so that they can serve their residents, their citizens, in a way that meets their special needs and in special circumstances, whether they be big cities or middle-sized ones or small villages. And of course, that's the way our municipal government system operates. And given free rein, municipalities have operated extremely well and don't end up in dire straits very, very often. It's a fairly unused section of our legislation where a municipality will actually be taken over by the province, because the responsibility of municipalities is exercised quite well by those elected officials at the municipal level. So I'm hoping that the upshot of this legislation, should the amendment not pass, is not going to be the necessity for municipal authorities to reconsider what they're planning to do in an emergency declaration and have to wonder whether or not the province will strike them down, or wondering whether they should be seeking prior counsel from the province, or seeking some under the table or outside the channel authority from the province to actually go ahead, before they go ahead and exercise their authority under the law to determine that a declaration of an emergency measure must be made. So once again, I always try to bring it back to the individuals that this is really going to affect, whether it's the major cities in Edmonton and Calgary, Red Deer and so forth, or small municipalities, or even the rural counties. I mean, the rural counties, of course, would be the ones who most likely would be the ones to have fear of their decisions to enact an emergency measure being second-guessed by the province, because they are subject to perhaps a little more direct oversight, and it may take maybe not even an official measure, maybe it only be a phone call or a wink or a nudge from a higher level authority that this indeed is going to invoke the ire of the province, and they may end up having to change their emergency measure because the province isn't happy with it. So it alters fundamentally, Madam Chair, I contend, the relationship between the municipalities and the provincial government at a time when they least need to have to second-guess their decisions. They need to be able to exercise the authority they have. And I don't think that the municipalities have demonstrated a behavior over the years that would require the province to step in and want to have this power to tinker, when in fact they have the power, as the minister rightfully said, to completely eliminate the emergency declaration that a municipality decides to invoke. And on top of that, they could eliminate the municipality itself. So once again, I wonder, as we talked about earlier this morning in debate, I wonder indeed what lingering effect this will have on the relationship between the province and municipality, because as always, during a time of emergency, measures are taken to deal directly with the issues at hand, and decisions are made quickly, but they have long-term effects. And I fear that the relationship damage that can be done here is something that is not being considered by the bill. So I fully hope that the amendment to this legislation that we're supporting to strike Section 8 is one that's accepted by government members. I know members on this side will. But initially, the whole intent, the underlying intent of the legislation that the government brought forward to adjust the relationship between the province and the city in terms of emergency declarations was, what I understood it to be, was to allow the coincidental operation of emergency declarations provincially and municipally. Previously, of course, it wasn't permitted to do that, and that in and of itself is a reasonable thing to do. To have both municipal and provincial declarations operate coincidentally during an emergent time frame is a wise piece of legislation to bring forward and to put into place. But this particular reach into the decision-making process of the municipalities, where in a time of an emergency, whether it be a fire, a flood, or a pandemic, a emergency in a municipality that they might declare could potentially be something of a more local nature, whether it's like a chemical spill or a train derailment or a bad road accident with some dangerous goods involved. To have the municipality sort of hamstrung by the requirement to always be acknowledged that the province might step in and second guess their decisions, I think is adding in a red tape, an unseen, let's say an invisible piece of red tape that perhaps wasn't thought through by the government when they're implementing this. And I hesitate to think how much this might have a lasting effect on the relationship between provincial and municipal governments when during an emergency situation the municipality is having to second guess its own decisions, and then afterwards, after the emergency is passed, that relationship has sort of been altered and developed in such a way that there's a culture then of the municipality thinking, well, goodness, should we go ahead with X, Y, or Z policy because it may not suit the direction the province wants us to take. And that's a cold and shuddering thought to have, that municipalities would be so cloistered as to think that they would have to consider every measure they take within the framework of whether the province would give its blessing or not. If that would happen, Madam Chair, I think that we maybe eliminate the need for municipal governments altogether and simply have appointed administrations in municipalities, appointees by the province. So I just think the mindset that the municipalities will get as a result of this is that it's sort of a father knows best intrusion into their area of jurisdiction. And I'd hate to see that influence a long-term relationship between municipalities and the province as a result. So obviously permitting coincidental operation of provincial and municipal emergency measures is a good thing, but this I think goes a long way to sort of suggesting that there's a forced requirement to gain permission in advance for moves that should be made fairly quickly during an emergency situation. And in this situation that we face right now, some have said it's a slow-moving emergency, yet there are things that we're racing to do in advance of the expected surge of the pandemic, and that requires the cooperation of both municipal and provincial authorities, including the collaboration and integration of their emergency measures that they have independently declared. So even in this pandemic, which may be a slow-moving contagion, relatively speaking, compared to some other types of disasters, it still can lead to some difficult decisions by municipal authorities about whether to go ahead with a particular measure. I know that there's some examples being made currently about this different level of government decision-making and influencing the other, and that has to do particularly with the masks that we're now told by our Chief Medical Officer of Health federally that they may help in preventing the spread of the virus if the mask wearer actually wears one, but won't prevent you from getting the virus. And after a few weeks of wondering indeed whether or not one should wear a mask or whether one shouldn't, there's been a declaration by the Chief Medical Officer of Health of Canada, and now, of course, repeated by our own provincial Chief Medical Officer of Health, that there may be some benefit to it, but there are also risks. And that was the reason that they withheld their agreement to give Canadians and Albertans the sort of a green light to go ahead and say, yes, indeed, this is a very positive thing to do, because there are risks involved with it. And what I know that levels of government were concerned about was contradicting each other, and that resulted in a delay of a real decision that the Canadians were hoping to hear about, and all kinds of things happened as a result of that. There's major sewing bees going on across the country right now. I think there's some people are running out of fabric that they thought they would never run out of from their sewing rooms, and machines are getting up and running that haven't been running in years, making masks of various qualities, and they may or may not be workable masks that the Chief Medical Officer of Health would authorize, but because of the lack of decision-making collaboration and perhaps a second guessing of both authorities, they resulted in the public making up their own reasons and going ahead with these mass sewing bees. So I know that there may be unintended consequences as a result of a policy of the municipality that where a decision doesn't get made because they're waiting and wondering and deciding what in fact the province might do if they went ahead with it, and therefore there's a stall in that, and the public might be waiting for a decision. I won't get into hypothetical circumstances, but just look at it in principle right now. The municipality hesitation could cause definite consternation in the public, and the only reason that the municipality would be hesitating is because they're wondering whether or not the provincial government will actually come in and rescind whatever decision they make. So that's something I think we really need to think about, and I don't know if the government has really thought through why the tinkering mechanism of Section 8 is required, when in fact, as they admit, they're able to rescind the whole Emergency Measures Act that a municipality might go ahead and invoke. So I would encourage all members to think through this measure and support the amendment, and basically revert back to the original language of the EMA, and continue to rely upon the very satisfactory relationship between municipalities and provincial government, particularly in times of emergency, that we've seen exist over many decades, including more recently within recent memory, where we've had fire and flood ravage our province, and that has resulted in a very significant an intense level of cooperation and collaboration between municipal governments and our provincial government, and it didn't cause a great hue and cry from the municipalities to come ahead and amend the Act to allow the provincial government to tinker.
Any other members wishing to speak to Amendment A2 on Bill 13? The Honourable Member for Fort McMurray, Wood Buffalo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate the honour to speak in this House. As I was listening to the opposition speak on this, it kind of crossed my thoughts that I've probably forgotten more about emergency management than they know collectively or ever will about it. Advanced life support, giving medications, intubating, defibrillating, you name it, to firefighting 101, even wildland firefighting, dangerous goods, high angle rescue, you name it. I've taken those courses. And I've also been very fortunate in my career to go into the management side of things and run a lot of these things, and also participate in emergency operations centers on high-level incidents that have impacted a lot of people. And when the good minister put out this bill, I was very curious about it because it, considered to be a bit, my wheelhouse. And it's a good bill. And I don't feel it needing any changes. And this amendment that the opposition has requested was actually very specifically the question I had asked the minister when he was consulting with our caucus on this bill. And my concern was by granting the municipalities and the individual agencies in different regions so much power, there are sometimes challenges and other things that throw things out of the loop, and sometimes are overbearing decision making, you name it, and the minister addressed that. See, because when my good friends who are in government are making these bills, and I really respect them for that, they have to recognize the lowest common denominators. They have to recognize the worst case scenarios about what could happen in these incidents. So they have to ensure that the powers are there to make sure that there is balance. Again, when they're concerned about a lot of these things, they're making these rules. As many of the members across the way who were in cabinet at one time know, you have to address all the issues. Yes, the lowest common denominators. Know that every time my good friends in government are making a decision or writing bills, they're thinking about you folks across the way in the opposition. The decisions they make are very pragmatic. And especially in this current environment that we have right now in our society, if there are errors, we're going to learn from them. But what the minister currently is doing right now is really giving some great powers, greater than what they ever were, to these municipalities. And this is an assurance that he's not going to push further, that he has an ace up his sleeve, if you will, to make sure that things function in a good and appropriate way. So with that, I just want to speak very quickly. I'm not here to drag out the clock like the opposition is, but certainly I just want to point out that this is a good bill. It doesn't need this amendment. I'm asking everyone in the House to vote this down because this literally addresses the one issue I had, and with my experience. And I'll end it with that. And also, Calgary Buffalo, your pin is upside down. And you probably mistook it for your cross, but you should turn it back side up. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Well, are there any other speakers to Amendment A2 on Bill 13? The Honourable Member for Calgary Buffalo.
I dropped one of the things from the back of it. Thank you very much for pointing it out. 666 is not my address, by the way, but it's 1616. I do want to. I'll keep talking. I do want to say, course, I'm going to take the minister at his word that he sees this a downgrading of potential impact that he would have as a result of the previous 19, in the EMA Section 19 and Section 22. That the one that's before us here under Section 8, which I've, admittedly kind of taken a sledgehammer to approach where, saying get rid of the whole thing. But had we had the opportunity to operate, and I know we're in a pandemic, but operate more normally, perhaps more reflection from my side would have gone into the approach to recommend improvements to this bill. And it's always been my intent to look to improve it. And that's, I think, as it should be for all of us, that when we look at legislation, potential legislation. So, I've always wanted to see anything that's done in this section to be in consultation with the local authority. And my reading of it is that the minister may unilaterally do these things that a local authority has established. And that seems still heavy-handed. And so, a lighter touch would have been, I'm offering that in consultation with the local authority, the minister may then continue to do all the things that are here. And so arguably, we don't have a lot of time as a opposition when we get these bills. They are given to us the day before. We're here 2 days into it or a day and a half into it. And it's always been my intent, after speaking to different people, to try and improve this. And all I've ever said when I stood up on my feet was that the minister may do these things, but he should at least, or that person should at least talk to the local authority and ensure that it's put in writing in a bill like this, because this minister will change. In 5 years, in 10 years, there'll be a different person here. And they may look at this and say, I can do what I want. I don't necessarily think that's the intent of this minister, but a minister could do that. They can do it unilaterally and take the actions they want without even advising local authorities that they're doing. So in consultation with a local authority, then the minister may do all the things that they are identified here, rescinding or canceling or modifying a bylaw, a resolution, an action, an order taken by that local authority around the local emergency in good faith. The things they have done in good faith, that they thought they were doing in the best interest of their municipality. I wouldn't, as a former elected official at the local level, if I wasn't even asked, if our council wasn't even asked by a minister of the day to look at something we've done, I'd feel usurped. I'd feel like, what's the point if the things I've done in good faith aren't even investigated and talked with and have a dialogue with the minister of the day to make sure they understand exactly why we did what we did. So I think, Madam Chair, that certainly I appreciate where the amendment on the floor is a sledgehammer. I intended always to try and improve this, and the only way I could see of doing it in the short time we had was to remove it entirely. I think on reflection, what I believe is in the best interest of this section and municipalities around the province is that they would have consultation with the minister, and that would be in writing before the minister would take the action that's identified here. So I recognize procedurally we're kind of hooped a little bit with one amendment on the floor and me talking very differently in terms of how to improve this bill. But perhaps the minister has heard and can appreciate that my intent always was to see this bill improved, and if the words "in consultation with the local authority, the minister may," and then go on for the rest of it, that would do it for me. Recognizing that that minister, this government, won't always be in place. There'll be other people here, and they will be looking at these words, and if they're not clear, they will take actions that may be not in the best interest of municipalities around the province. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Any other members wishing to speak to Amendment A2? I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Goldbar.
Thank my friend from Calgary Buffalo for bringing his personal experience as a city councillor in the city of Calgary for 15 years to bear on this debate. And of course, I want to thank the Minister for Municipal Affairs again for being so heavily engaged in this debate. I appreciate his interjections as well. And I'll just reiterate what I said yesterday at second reading to this bill, that we are here in this chamber to debate this legislation just to make sure that we're doing a good job, and that what we're making the law of the province is the best that it can be. And I think that it's fair to say that we've learned the lesson from the last 2 weeks, that perhaps we've been letting things go through this House a little bit too quickly without the kind of critical, rigorous analysis that we need to put on these pieces of legislation, because it was only on the 20th of March, according to the legislative calendar, that we dealt with some amendments to the Emergency Management Act for the first time. And I appreciate that the minister says that municipalities have asked for these powers, or for these amendments, rather. But surely that must have been known to the minister and the municipalities at the time that the first Emergency Management Amendment Act came forward. And I don't understand why it couldn't have been brought forward at that time. And I see the Minister of Municipal Affairs is taking issue with my comments, and I'm looking forward to hearing his explanation as to why it wasn't dealt with 2 weeks ago, or why it couldn't have been dealt with in the normal course of the operations of this legislature. Had the Emergency Management Act, Amendment Act, been dealt with in the conventional means of dealing with legislation here in this House, we probably could have landed in a place where we could have had these amendments in the first place, and we wouldn't have to have gone back for a second time to be looking at this bill again. So I hope that the minister can provide us an explanation as to what has transpired in the last 2 weeks that made it so that we couldn't have dealt with this 2 weeks ago, and that we're dealing with it now. And like I said, I think we here in the official opposition have learned our lesson, that by letting the legislation go through without the level of rigorous critical analysis that every piece of legislation demands us to give, that we're making mistakes, and when we make mistakes we have to go back and do the work again. And I know, I appreciate the minister's assertion that we need to also work efficiently, especially in the time of a pandemic. But I would assert that it's much more efficient to do the job right the first time and not have to go back and do it again when we rush things and make mistakes. So I hope that the minister will be able to respond to that question. I also want to address a couple of the comments made by my colleagues from Calgary West and Fort McMurray, Wood Buffalo. They've both indicated that they have significant experience dealing with municipal services during local states of emergency. And so I'm curious to know, in their experience, how these amendments would make the jobs that they had to do when they were in those positions easier or better. The member from Fort McMurray, Wood Buffalo, touched on it a little bit, but he didn't really give us any details or examples, and that would certainly help us with the official opposition know exactly what kinds of things municipalities are looking for from this amendment to help everybody do their job better. Because that's what we're here for. We're not here, as the minister says, to filibuster and delay. We're here to make sure that we're getting this legislation right. And because of the rushed nature of legislation going through the House these days, Committee of the Whole is really the only opportunity for us to really dig into these issues and get a better understanding of why we're doing what we're doing. And I know that I and the constituents that I represent would love to have some examples of how these new proposed amendments will make the work that municipal affairs does during the time of an emergency better. And I appreciate that the minister has raised the fact that AUMA has put out a press release and said that they want these changes. My friend from Calgary Buffalo has said quite clearly that the City of Calgary is not in favor of these changes. But I think what would be a valuable contribution to this debate is what specifically is, and you know, my friend from Calgary Buffalo has quite at length talked about the things that Calgarians and the Calgary municipal government are concerned about in this bill. He's given specific examples. And so I would challenge the minister and the members opposite to give us some concrete counterexamples of why it is they're seeking to make these amendments. And I share my friend from Calgary Buffalo's concerns about the changes that are presented in Section 8, particularly Section 8 1.02, which says that the minister may by order rescind, cancel, or modify any bylaw enacted, resolution passed, action taken, order made, or direction given by a local authority during a state of local emergency. So that means that if this amendment passes, or if this bill passes, the minister can say that anything that a local government does during a state of emergency could be rescinded or modified. Anything. So, you know, I don't have familiarity with what's going on with the City of Calgary and the local emergency measures that they're taking. I represent an Edmonton constituency, so I'm a little bit more familiar with the things that Edmonton is doing in their local state of emergency. And so I'm wondering if I give the minister some examples, if he can tell me, are these the kinds of things that he's looking to modify, change, or rescind? You know, on April 8th, the City of Edmonton says that they're making changes to pedestrian signals. They will adjust push buttons at pedestrian crossings and allocate some roadways to shared use effective Thursday. These changes will help prevent the spread of COVID-19 and encourage physical distancing while Edmontonians are outside. Is that an example of something, of a decision that the local authority has made that the minister wants to override? And if it is, why? Similarly, on April 8th, the City of Edmonton announced some road use changes. The city has adjusted 2 roads in busy and densely populated areas to provide more space to pedestrians and cyclists. And those areas are the Victoria Promenade on 100th Avenue from 116th Street to 121st Street, and Saskatchewan Drive from 105th Street to 109th Street. So these changes will allow for Edmontonians to physically distance, or to meet the physical distance requirements while safely enjoying the outdoors. Is that the kind of action that a local council can make that the minister wants to override? And if so, I hope that he can explain to us why. You know, Also on April 7th, the city is providing capital city cleanup kits to grocery stores and pharmacies across Edmonton in response to an increase of personal protective equipment. Is that something that the minister is taking issue with? Is that something that the city of Edmonton done that the minister doesn't agree with or is even concerned about? And if so, why is that the case? The city said that they're going to increase the frequency and intensity of cleaning in their transit facilities. Does the minister have concerns with how frequently the city of Edmonton is cleaning its transit facilities? And if he does, what proposed changes is he going to make to how the city is managing the cleaning of its transit facilities? Waste collection. Now, there are no changes to waste collection right now during the City of Edmonton's local state of emergency. Does the minister think that maybe the City of Edmonton should be doing something different with how the City of Edmonton is collecting waste during this time? And if he is, why? And I hear members opposite saying that this is absurd, and I agree. It is absurd because the minister is asking for the power to do exactly these things, to go into the City of Edmonton's business and say, hey, we want the power to modify or rescind or add to any of these things. And so why does he want to do that? We haven't heard clearly from the minister why he would want to dictate to the City of Edmonton what they're doing with waste collection. With respect to enforcement, and I suspect that this would probably be a concern to the member from Leduc-Beaumont because of his history as an Edmonton Police Service member. The city is encouraging voluntary compliance and is focusing on educating citizens found violating any orders, but will write tickets when appropriate. Does the minister have concerns with the way that the City of Edmonton is enforcing local and provincial health orders right now? Does he want the power to go in and change those individually? And if he does, why? Edmonton's 311 service remains available for citizens seeking information about COVID-19 requirements. Is the minister concerned about how Edmonton is delivering its 311 services right now? The City Hall parkade has been closed to protect the public. Does the minister take issue with the City Hall closing its own parkade to protect the public? And if he has those concerns, what are they and why would he change what the city is doing there? I talked about dog park restrictions yesterday when this bill was in second reading. Vehicle for hire services, the city has made extensive changes to how vehicle for hire services are being delivered in the province, or in the city of Edmonton. Does the minister take issue with what the city of Edmonton is doing with respect to changing how vehicle for hire services are delivered? And if he does, I would appreciate it if he tells us. Golf courses are closed. Now, I know that this isn't exactly the prime golf season, but we don't know how long we're going to be in this pandemic. And I don't know if the minister takes issue with the City of Edmonton closing its golf courses. Would he, if given these powers, go in and demand that the City of Edmonton open its golf courses during the time of a pandemic? I don't know. And we haven't heard from the minister or anyone from the government benches as to why they want the power to go in and meddle with these individual decisions that the local authorities are making. We talked about playground closures yesterday. This is a controversial, and it's not controversial. I fully support the closure of playgrounds because I don't want my kids spreading any potential diseases that they may have or coming into contact with other folks who do on a playground. But perhaps the Minister of Municipal Affairs knows differently from the City of Edmonton and would like to rescind or modify that order. City of Edmonton has also closed a number of city service counters. In Edmonton Service Centre, City Hall, they've closed the Landlord and Tenant Advisory Board counter. Now, we've heard from members opposite during debate on Bill 3 the urgency that they're addressing resident, tenant, and landlord issues. Would the minister go in and force the City of Edmonton to open up its Landlord and Tenant Advisory Board during this time? And if he would, why? Again, with waste delivery, although there are no changes to waste collection, there have been changes to how we're handling recycling in the City of Edmonton. The Ambleside Eco Station is temporarily closed. Paint exchange is not being accepted at any eco station until further notice, and cash payments are no longer being accepted until further notice. Does the minister take issue with how the City of Edmonton is handling its recycling facilities? Is there something about these changes, closing the Ambleside Eco Station, not accepting paint exchanges anymore, or not accepting cash payments, that he would take issue with? And if he does, then I think it's incumbent upon him to tell us why he would want to make those changes. Animal care and control centers are closed. The facility will accept animals by appointment that are in distress, injured, or sick. But anyone who finds an animal experiencing these conditions is asked to first call 311 for further instructions. Does the minister have any concerns about how the City of Edmonton is handling animal care and control right now? Cemetery services are closed. You can't have a service with more than 15 people right now, and that's a provincial order. But it's up to the local municipality. The City of Edmonton operates a number of municipal cemeteries right now. Does the minister take issue with how cemetery services are being handled by the City of Edmonton during this time of a local state of emergency? And if he does, please tell us how it is that he's plans to improve how the City of Edmonton is responding to these things. So this is an extensive list of a number of actions that one municipality has taken since they declared a local state of emergency in 2 weeks. Now, just imagine multiplying that number by 340. And that gives you an idea of how many different bylaws, orders, actions have been taken by municipalities all across this province. And the minister is saying to us that it is reasonable for him to have powers so granular that he can go in and change how a municipality is handling recycling services or golf courses during a time of a pandemic. And maybe there's something I'm missing, Madam Chair. And that's why we're here. So that we can raise questions to the minister and have him respond to us with answers so that we can modify the legislation and make sure that it's appropriate. So with that, Madam Chair, I think I've raised my issues, just to recap. Why didn't we get this right the first time on the 20th of March? Why are we here 2 weeks later when we should have known that these amendments had been asked for by the municipalities? And had we allowed that legislation to go through the normal processes of this House, we could have probably gotten it right the first time and we wouldn't have to be dealing with this a second time now. And what specifically will improve or change or be better for the people of Alberta and its municipalities by giving the minister the powers to go in and amend individual orders, actions taken, or bylaws that have been passed by municipalities during the states of emergency. I'm eagerly anticipating a response from the government. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Are there any other members wishing to speak to Amendment A2? The Honourable Member for Lac St. Anne Parkland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to make mine really quick. Again, keeping up with the tone I took this morning. Obviously, we're all here during a crisis type situation. Everyone feels that this is very relevant information to allow both municipalities, the MG Act work. We've already had the support read by the bodies that were originally pointed out by the member of Buffalo. I know he gets me confused with the member of Highwood, so I just want to make sure I'm saying his right. Member of Calgary Buffalo. So what I've seen happen over here the last about hour in the shot clock here roughly is that there was concerns about non-consultation with those authorities. By the member of Buffalo, he had said that Calgary, and this is paraphrasing because I'll make it quick because we know we have a lot of things to work on here today. Calgary wasn't good with it. Edmonton was cool with it. Didn't talk to the other 7 majors. Didn't have time to because, well, we didn't consult, or he didn't have a chance to consult. I was going to mention that his mace is upside down. There was symbolism to that, but that's already been rectified because you never fly a flag upside down unless there's a major duress event. Wanted to make sure that the ledge is still sound, so we're good there. Sorry. Trying to inject a little bit of humor on that one. So if the member of Gold Bar doesn't take exception to that, I hope. We've already heard from the minister now that, well, actually he has in writing. All of these folks do support it. They do support the initiatives. They understand that there's a heavy-handed approach that you would within the current legislation that says termination or nothing. This is actually allowing a stepped approach. So if there was some collaborative effort, or if we could step in as governors on this level, provincial level, that we could help out and we could assist with that. To me, that doesn't seem very heavy-handed. That seems prudent, given what we're into right now. And again, the same folks that we're concerned about, rightly so, making sure we have time to go through due diligence, are actually on board with this. So that's already been given here before the next speakers came up. What else do we have here? Heard comments. You know, we don't have the blues or anything else, and the comments to having the stepped approach, and the minister had pointed out that you've got the termination clause or nothing. The comment was, yeah, but it's never used. So the fact that we're not using the heavy-handed approach now, we're going to put a step measure in place that offers concern, even though in times, governments have never used the heavy-handed approach and terminated it. So we're into unprecedented times. We're looking at a stepped, measured approach. Similarly to the days and the extensions, we talked about that. We talked about why it would make sense to have that window, that lengthened window over the 7 days was originally there, and the proposal of 30 days made sense, talking through the arguments. However, given those timelines, what we're dealing with. This, to me, again, seems like it's a good approach. There's another saying out there that kept coming to mind when I was hearing the debate, and it's paralysis by analysis. We can paralyze this whole system if we want to sit here, or we can carry on. There's some really good points here, and I've heard from our side mentioned a number of times now from a couple members that, yeah, they had concerns. It was addressed with the minister through the consultation. They actually consulted with these counties or the cities themselves, and that's good. We have that in writing. We heard from the member from Buffalo suggesting now that he made this amendment. There was a methodology for it. He spoke the second time saying that, well, this isn't really relevant, and not relevant, paraphrasing here again, but he wouldn't have submitted this addendum, as it were, based on the information he's heard in this chamber, and that wasn't his intent to use a sledgehammer, again paraphrasing, because he probably would have done something differently now. We also heard those consultations took place in the front, so with the minister and his critic, they talked about that. I heard that it was about feelings. So even though after in the second statement it was acknowledged that the City of Calgary had put it forward, City of Edmonton, it was the feelings. So the feelings of a former council member from that city. So now it was justification of how he would feel in that circumstance. Well, I'm sorry, you're not there. We can issue a hurt feelings report. They're very much, you know, in our industry, we do that when the feelings get bent. But let's carry on with business. It's not about your feelings. It's about what's sitting in front of us and the facts. We need to take care of business. There's another thing that came to mind, and again, I'm going to ramble a bit, and I'm trying to keep my stick on the ice again, but there's this old adage out there that, how do you catch a thief? Well, you think like one. So how do you govern in a draconian way? You listen to the what-if report from people that may abuse powers, potentially. All these what-if scenarios, what if. I would never consider that, because I would consider the people in place who come to this place and are elected by their members are doing the right thing for their constituents. We swear an oath and we even say a prayer of how we govern here. To get to this level and to govern like this, it's almost an expectation. So I would never consider someone who gets in those powers. Paralysis by analysis. You know, coming back to the one comment from the member in the back, it was McClung, I believe. And again, paraphrasing, you don't want to get in hot water, but paraphrasing, that running through a scenario of what would happen if a council had to second guess itself for the fear of that, Big Brother would come in place and overstep. Well, let's hope in the first place that you never elect a council like that who can't make a flippant decision from what they're hired to do. And secondly, if they are in that position, maybe somebody should help them make the decisions, because again, potentially they've never had the experience of making decisions and being accountable and held responsible for it, because given those circumstances, it wasn't required or they didn't have the depth. So in these events and in these times, here's your fail-safe. The fail-safe is we can come in and help tweak and help go through that process to make sure these measures are in place, because they're all our constituents, regardless of our political boundaries, one taxpayer, that everything is taken care of, that we do have a minimalized government, that they are working together and the right reasons for that to make sure it happens. So I would suggest, given that the member from Buffalo, his original statement, his original addendum, given the chance, he would have amended it, he would have amended his amendment to the amendment. Let's end this, call it to question, move on to the next thing, get back to talking about the bill, and let's get the people that are watching this, hopefully at home, something better to do than to see us keep debating and going over our feelings, what if we might do it this way or that way. Let's carry on. Take it at face, let's carry on, call it to question, get back on the bill, and hopefully we can conduct some real meaningful business here in the next 15 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that we rise and report progress on Bill 13.
The motion to rise and report progress. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. So carried. We shall now rise and report progress. The Honourable Member for Lac St. Anne Parkland.
Madam Speaker, the Committee of the Whole had under consideration certain bills. The committee reports progress on the following bill, Bill 13. Madam Speaker, I wish to table copies of all the amendments considered by the Committee of the Whole on this date for the official records of the Assembly.
Does the Assembly concur in the report? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. So carried. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I wish to advise the Assembly pursuant to Government Motion 10, Part A1. The Assembly now stands adjourned.
Honourable Members, the Assembly is now adjourned.
Order.